Well, welcome to the Emotional Mastery Podcast. Today I have Alex Mufson, right? Is that correct?
That's correct. You got
Okay.
it.
Second guess myself there. Human design expert, founder and CEO of Rev and a human first business. And I find that so fascinating because I've been in the human design sort of world for I think I'm going on between 5 and 6 years now, like 5.5 years. And, it's like every time we like peel back a layer, it's like something new comes up, some new shadow, some new thing that we have to overcome. And so my journey has primarily been in just like personal development with human design, but I always find it so fascinating when it's layered in with business because I think especially entrepreneurship has a lot to do with personal development. And so
Oh my goodness. Yes. Yeah, that
yeah.
is, you cannot overstate how much our businesses and ourselves are entangled as entrepreneurs, and just our relationship to work is so
Mm-hmm.
complex in this late stage capitalism world that we live in.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And yeah, so I don't I'll kind of hand you the floor and just, you can share as much or as little as you'd like about like your story, pivotal moments along the way that kind of got you to what you're doing now. And then we can just take it from there.
That's a big question and I love it. If you had asked me 10 years ago if I would be teaching through the lens of something called human design that was not a peer-reviewed science, that all of this, I would have said absolutely not. I am a licensed clinician by training, though I came there by way of being a horse trainer and an animal behaviorist. So I always say that I took the scenic route, but I learned most of what I learned about behavior and feelings through horses, which I love because they're nonverbal animals. And I think there's so much happening for humans on the verbal level that we can get distracted by the fact that that's just like one small way that we express ourselves and one small way that we process. And what's living in our body and in our nonverbal world is as impactful as it is for an animal that doesn't have speech the way that we have speech. So that's very much where I started professionally, which doesn't necessarily look like, oh, that's a straight line to business mentorship.
Hmm.
But I was always an entrepreneur. 3 years old, I did not have an imaginary friend. I had an imaginary business. I was obviously the CEO, and I was very angry at my mother for not taking me to the airport. I don't remember the whole story, but I do remember the anger that I felt when she refused to take me to Chicago's O'Hare Airport as a 3-year-old and drop me off because I was the CEO of a company that had the last remaining woolly mammoth, and my assistant Michelle was waiting for me in South America. And to this day, I miss that meeting, obviously, because of
Yeah.
my mom. So you have a daughter, so you can probably feel
Yeah.
the weight my mom felt. She took me to the pediatrician. She was like, "Is
Mm.
my daughter crazy?"
Yeah.
The answer was no, but I am an entrepreneur.
Mm.
So I started I had many businesses as a pre-18-year-old, always hustling, but I started in animal behavior as a horse trainer. And then my whole world was rocked when I was 24, when I started to have what is still a mystery brain disease. And at the time, I thought I would die. Like there was no outcome that I thought led to even me being as old as I am now. I didn't die. And in the process, I was no longer able to hold my emotional life, my distress through working with my body. That was a very physical job, though I really loved the emotional and intellectual pursuit of being deeply entangled with horses and their humans. It was also being a professional athlete. So when that was suddenly and really destructively not something that not only could I do it to the level I wanted to in that moment, but I also didn't foresee a path where if I did live, I would be able to pursue that career in the way that was my whole life. It wasn't like a career to me. It was my life since I was, 6 years old with horses. So that completely changed the trajectory of what I thought my life was going to go, or what it was going to be and who I was going to be. And in the process, I started doing therapy as a client. And then I opted to go to get my master's, become a therapist because it was so impactful to me to do that work and find my way to being okay with a new version of myself. I'm very lucky in that though I've had a lot of medical challenges since, I can still walk and I am still able-bodied, but I will never be the athlete that I was. And at that point, I thought that I would, end up dead. So I did a lot of acceptance work in that, and I wanted to move that forward in my life for others. And I had the sort of client base as a horse trainer that had been asking me for years if they could sit with me outside of the riding arena because I was constantly decentering the horse's behavior and centering how the human showed up in relationships. So it all kind of made sense.
Mhm.
Um, and then, of course, life happened, and things that I couldn't have predicted occurred, and I started working for my licensure hours at whatever treatment center I could find, and that ended up being deeply impactful and showing me some entrepreneur opportunities once I did complete my master's and wasn't dead, that I could start a business and fill in some needs. At that point, I was focused on keeping people out of residential treatment because I had just happened to end up working in a residential treatment center for almost 6 years during the graduate portion. You have to get like licensure hours and internship hours to be a therapist. And so I'm in rural Montana. There weren't a lot of options. And so I just ended up at a treatment center. And then I really wanted to disrupt that sort of cycle of young people being in institutions for 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. I mean, I had kids who I worked with when they were 18. They hadn't been out of a treatment center since they were 12. So I really wanted to disrupt that. And so that's how everything pivoted from the original horse training business that I was going to evolve into a therapy practice, into what turned out to be a company that scaled 0 to 7 figures in under 3 years, and I was on that ride for a bit, and that taught me a lot. That taught me so much about really what I hadn't done for myself in my first business as a horse trainer. Because as a horse trainer, that business depended completely on my body and my energy. And when my body and my energy was no longer available to me in the same way, the business actually didn't support me. It didn't support my healing. It didn't help me in any way. It just stopped. And human design entered my life as I was scaling this new business and enforce some of the experiments I was already doing to try to accept and also flourish within where I should be in a system, not where a lot of external conditioning that says if you're not moving, if you're not going, if you're not pushing and over functioning for everyone, you're not doing enough. That's a narrative that I think most people, especially people conditioned as women in our society, are familiar with. And so I took a radically different approach to scaling the business. And it doesn't mean I didn't work really, really hard, but I also worked very intentionally within the human design framework. And I do believe that that's a huge reason why, in scaling that quickly, I actually got healthier and not sicker, because usually you hear that story very differently than
Yeah.
that.
Mhm.
And so after that project felt complete to me, I'm a founder at heart. Like once it's stable, I don't really have much interest anymore. And that's just my position in this ecosystem of businesses. Um, I had other projects in mind, and one of them is Rev, which is now alive, which is supporting other people to redefine their definition of what business is and really disrupt capitalism from the inside. Because I don't predict that in my lifetime, at least, capitalism is going to go anywhere. I hope it maybe gets a bit um, more caring, but I don't believe that it's just going to vanish. And so, how do we get inside the belly of the beast? And how do we create businesses that, if you're 24 and suddenly having brain hemorrhages, your business takes care of you instead of just dropping you.
Yeah.
And that, now that I know how to do that and I have done it, I want to free as many people as I can in their relationships to work, because most people do have to have some relationship to work in one way or another. And that isn't just me. I have amazing professionals, whether it's, the HR part of it that's holding you back, or, you could really benefit from a CEO mentor like me, or it's trauma and old stuff holding you back, or the fact that you're so burnt out, your adrenals are fried. I have all of those people coming together on the team because we think the more people we can get healthy and have building their livelihoods based on health and frankly love and compassion, the more the money is going to be in the right people's hands instead of where it usually is. So we're all about redirecting the flow of capital from those who do harm with it, which is most people who have money right now, to those who are healing with it, which is hopefully our audience.
Yeah. Wow. I have so many questions and I love that mission, and a lot of what I do is sort of body based, like connecting with your body, understanding your body, and that's where human design kind of comes into play. I guess like kind of rewinding. First of all, can you share your human design and your astrology big three if you know them?
I would love to. So I definitely feel more connected to my human design
Mhm.
simply because that's what I'm studying, though I am aspiring and in the process of studying astrology right now, which is
I think
exciting.
I think they go hand in hand eventually because I
Yes.
started in
Yes.
astrology and quickly went
And you
over to
went the other
astrology as well.
way?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I'm in an advanced course right now, which is
Yeah.
great. So
I love it.
I am a 1/3 splenic projector.
Okay.
I feel really connected to the splenic authority. And though that was probably the first thing that I was like, oh, this gives me language for something
Mm.
that kind of I thought was crazy before.
Yeah.
I'm also a Pisces and a Libra rising, but I'm
Okay.
curious, what's your design so we know who we're talking
Yeah.
to?
I'm a 6'3" emotional manifesting generator.
Cool.
Yeah.
I love Manny
And
Gens.
so,
I'm partnered with a Manny
okay.
Gen. I feel like a very special connection between projectors and Manny Gens.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a lot of deconditioning. And I mean, I'm still like in the process of that. Like it's a lot of I mean, I think any type and it's a lot of work when it comes to
I
that.
mean, you have three things. Do you mind if I
Yeah.
just observe about your
Yeah.
design? You have three things that I think would be really interesting. Like
Mhm.
you, as a Manny Gen, you're all about like what that spark is. You're excited about that novelty and making sure that you're not building and then just staying stuck in a rut. But
Mhm.
then you have an emotional authority, which means you have to take a lot of time to process and integrate before you make decisions. So that's probably right off the bat kind of tricky because you're like, oh, I
Mhm.
sparked at that, but now I have to wait to learn if it's for me.
Yeah.
And then I think the 6/3 profile is really fascinating because in two different ways, you have to gain wisdom through experience.
Mhm.
And for you, it's like, okay, you've got these long wisdom gaining times for that conscious sixth line that maybe you feel connected to, but then behind the scenes, can I swear on this podcast? Is that
Yes.
okay? Third line is like all about fucking around and finding
Yeah.
out. And
Yeah.
so it's like behind the scenes, you're like, I'm supposed to be this on this long arc of like the sixth line and, gaining wisdom. And then I'm just fucking around and finding out behind the
Mhm.
scenes and like lighting things on fire. So I can just see all of those things working together to make you, I don't know you, but that would be a really cool person to get to know.
Yeah, I think like my conditioning a lot comes from like being told to like act a certain way, be a certain way, be the good girl. So it's like I'm fighting this battle internally of like having to be this way, but when really I want to be this way, and when I'm this way, it's like, well, you give up too easily or you're doing too many things or you quit. You're not, it's all that narrative. And so I'm like really, spending a lot of time
Oh my
unpacking
gosh.
that so I can show up authentically,
Well,
in my
because
business.
manifesting generators, there's so much conditioning around like, you should do this and do it forever. And
Mm,
it's like, no, you're
yeah.
supposed to. And there's honestly a lot of, I think the clinician in me would call it like pathology attached.
Mm,
I've rarely met a manifesting generator that didn't at least suspect, if not have an official diagnosis of ADHD.
mhm.
And I kind of call bullshit on that because I want the Manny Gens out there sparking and then saying, okay, cool, got that started. Can you take this from here? Because I have a new idea.
Yeah.
And instead it's so pathologized as like
Mhm.
there's a problem. But there's no
Yeah.
problem. You're the joy. You're the
Yeah.
excitement in the world.
Yeah. Well, and I've also found like that I have that hanging gate 9 three times
Mm.
in my design. And so that's like that gate of like detail focus, right? So I find, with ADHD and stuff on top of being like a manny gen, but also literally feeling like I can't sit still because I'm so overwhelmed with like everything that's coming. I'm trying to see the big picture instead of just like what's in front of me, So
Mm.
it's
Do you
just
have very open mental center like your crown and your ajna or those?
my ajna is defined.
Mm.
But my root is undefined, which I find a
Yeah.
lot of that comes into play
Yes.
with my emotions, where I'm like, I got to do
Hmm.
it now, though. The thing is not going to be here tomorrow.
I have
It
an
really is.
undefined root too. I think
Yeah,
I
that
think
one's tough.
for entrepreneurs that have an undefined root, there's a
Hmm.
specific challenge in understanding when to stop and
Hmm.
also understanding that relationship to scarcity. And to be
Yeah.
honest, I think the undefined root can be actually really beautiful for entrepreneurs because our sense of urgency actually gets shit done.
Mm-hmm.
And it can also be incredibly toxic and screw up our
Yeah.
entire life and our adrenals, and you're just fried. And so it's really a matter of understanding how to both notice that impulse, but then also be like, where is my definition? And maybe I should like consult that once in a while so that my root center can chill out. Like it's okay. I've done enough for
Yeah.
today.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've been dating a reflector for like a year now, and he just like
Cool. A
is
Manny
yeah,
Jim and a
I know,
reflector.
right?
I'm fascinated. Tell me everything.
He's just so slow to do things, right? And he wants to start his own business. So he's like, "Oh, I
30
got to
days.
email." I know, and my energy is just like he'll be like, "Oh, I got to email this person. I got to email that person." I'll find myself because I'll be like, "Did you do it? Oh no, I'll do it tonight. Did you do it? No, I'll do it tonight." Then I just do it. Like I'll just email them.
It
Then I have
might
to
be
catch
interesting.
myself.
Yeah, that overfunctioning part that we're
Yeah.
conditioned, but it might be interesting with his like 28, 30-day kind of lunar cycle and then your emotional authority.
Mm-hmm.
Because even though you don't have the set rhythm of the moon that he does, which in
Mm-hmm.
some ways I though when I work with reflectors, they often express to me that that is frustrating to trust that that length of time is okay.
Yeah.
But also, it encourages you as an emotional authority because sometimes your authority actually might take longer than
Yeah.
28, 30 days. But because there's no concrete, measurable cycle for you, it's
Mm-hmm.
easy to jump ahead. So it'd be interesting to be almost forced to slow down in that partnership. I think that's quite
Yeah.
lovely.
It really has. Just in the aspect of like a title or commitment or like moving into something deeper, it's like it's been so confronting because I'm usually
Mhm.
like, okay, we like each other, let's do it, right? But he's just very like honoring himself without knowing that he's doing that, you know? And
Well, and
I
I would wonder if that is actually because you'll have a sacral response to things, which is
mm,
very like, just do it.
mm,
But that's not your authority from what you've
yeah,
shared. And so
yeah,
I find that people with emotional authority but defined sacrals often end up jumping at that sacral impulse because it feels so
mm-hmm,
good.
yeah,
And then being like, oops, I jumped too soon. So again, you've almost like you've maybe consciously or unconsciously
mm-hmm,
picked someone that like forces you to not act on your sacral definition, which is not
yeah.
your authority, and wait for yourself. That's
Yeah.
so cool.
Yeah, it is, but like I said, it's also very confronting because I'm not
Oh,
used to
totally.
operating that way. You know, I'm like so out of
I'm
my
saying cool,
yeah,
like the therapist in me is like, how
yeah.
interesting that you did that to yourself, but it must be really, really
Yeah.
challenging.
Yeah, it is. But I kind of want to go back to so when you were like that 3-year old, right? Like kind of go back to like your entrepreneurial roots and like knowing that you were a CEO of a company. And, you know, because I think a lot of, and it kind of ties into that conditioning piece, because I think a lot of us like have this like knowing from such a young age like what we want to do, right? And I'm kind of lumping myself into this other category as well, but yet, you know, so many things like our parents or we're conditioned out of thinking that we can do it, right? Like I've always felt so uncomfortable working for somebody else. It's always felt like but I also have those things I need to work through in order to like step into my like real entrepreneurial, and it's very trial and error, which I think the 6-3 part of me you know, supports. But you know, going from that age to being like, you need to take me to the airport, and then your mom taking you to the doctor, being like, is everything okay? Like, what was the thing that kept you, you know, I guess kept that fire and kept that motivation to like be an entrepreneur? Does that make sense?
I think it's a fantastic
Mm-hmm.
question. And I mean, I understand my mom's impulse there. Like I get that it was out of care, and that's her own generation's conditioning about deference to authority. Because the other question you can ask is, you know, tell me more about your business plan, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a mom, those it shows what she was taught and probably her parents were taught, and how many generations of like that sort of spirit is sick. And I do think that that's on a grander scale capitalism, because capitalism actually only serves a very select few at the top and wants to discourage too many workers from not feeling that they should abide by that system. And that's why I think that there is a healing way that we can engage capitalism, because if more healing people, and I don't mean just literal healers like therapists or naturopathic doctors or whatever. I mean artists and what you're doing and like all this like beautiful work that's out there. If more of us had that knowledge, like you said, that we weren't meant to just be defined by someone else, the money can still flow. that is actually not inherently good or bad. It's currently pretty bad, but it's not inherently good or bad. I think I think part of what kept I think this kept the spark alive in a couple of different ways. First of all, I do think in a weird way, I was lucky to graduate college right into the 2008 recession. So it's not like there were a ton of jobs anyway. So to be honest, it didn't occur to me to get a job because none of my friends could get jobs. Like
Mm,
it just wasn't available. So in some ways that was really helpful. And the fact that though I didn't study it in school, I had this vocation with the horses that
mm,
I felt very connected to. And so I think that is sort of like when all everything breaks down in society, the people who can do vocational work will still be working because people will still need, if there are cars, their car fixed, and if there are no cars, their horses getting ready to be ridden. So, there's certain things that helped me to have that confidence that I could do that. I also took it really seriously. I'm a 1-3, so my first line was really a part of this. I studied anti-capitalism and I studied the intersectional identity politics of our world deeply. My college degree is in feminist theory, and I think the more I learned, the more I realized how much of life is a construct and how much of it isn't inherent to how we have to live. And so I think I have this interesting collision of inherently believing that I was the CEO, whatever, I came out that way, um, being really interested in things like horses that are more vocationally based, and then having had whatever splenic hit to get a very counterculture education that taught me that everything from gender to work to the medical industrial complex is a construct that we have built. That freed me in a way to look at things and say, can I do them differently? And so even as a horse trainer, though I was certainly living my conditioning I think that was the first layer of deconditioning, was not going and getting quote unquote a real job. But then I was like the worst boss ever because I still acted like a shitty boss and overworked my body and acted like a generator when I'm a projector. But it was still a layer of deconditioning because from very early on, I never had a paycheck. So I just was like, when you need money, you figure out what someone else will pay for,
mm.
and then money will come. And I think I got that early reinforcement, which in a weird way, I never attached health insurance to a job. I never attached, like, I didn't know what paid time off was until I got the job that I had to get my clinical license because there's state requirements. It was the first time, like, it never occurred to me, like, oh, people get paid to take time off. Like, that
Mm.
hadn't been really infused in me very young. And so, in a lot of ways, that was very, very lucky because it just made anything possible.
Yeah. It's so interesting that first line, my daughter, she's also a 1-3. And part of her struggles right now is she feels purposeless. She doesn't know what she's going to do. And somebody completely not even a conversation about human design or anything was just suggesting like her finding like something that she's passionate about and just like focusing on that. Right. And that's so first line, like being able to dive into something that really like gives you that fire or like that purpose or because she'll find like random things and obsessed about it for like months, and I'm like, I'm always encouraging, I'm like, go for it, like she was obsessed with Germany and just like was learning German and like researching everything about Germany. And it's
Sure.
just like, so it's so interesting how, even things like that we can use that to like, even unknowingly, because I'm sure, you probably didn't know about human design when you were in college, and it's like, I love to see when people are like living out their design and they're not even knowing it.
Totally. And what I would have known, because in college, I was still riding and I was still working with horses, and I would work half the year at the university, and then I would go like to Wyoming and work in the mountains and pack
Mm.
mules into the wilderness for the other half of like I was having these adventures, total third line. And yes, I was messing up big time. But what I was also doing, what I would have said was, I want to go and start this business working with horses because I have to. I have to know how to do this. I have to get better. And I was already a very like competent rider, but I had so many questions And at that point, 21, I guess when I started that business, I just desperately wanted someone to pay me enough that I could just try to figure out these questions and then be able to pay my bills. Like that's literally all I wanted. And I do think that that helped keep that fire alive because it didn't feel optional to me because I had to figure out how whatever the question was, how this horse
Mm-hmm.
was thinking. And I think that's when I draw a line forward to Rev and how I work with clients who are primarily either established entrepreneurs and CEOs or they're experts in something else and they're trying to break into self-employment and take that skill with them. There's I think I think that all of the third line stuff that I've learned that I can now share with them came from it not feeling optional to me. So I learned a lot of things that if it's optional because there's you could just get a job and they have benefits and time off, you don't learn certain things because you feel like there's this option of a safety net. I never engaged with that. Like I don't remember in college thinking, and then I'll get a job. It just
Mm-hmm.
never occurred to me. And I think that's really lucky in some ways. And I think your advice to your daughter as a 1-3 is really smart because once you're passionate and once you're focused on whatever it is, especially as a first line and that learning, it's not optional anymore. And so then the path just kind of flows in front of you. Similar to now, I don't feel like it's optional for me to share what I've learned at the intersection of my therapist training and my entrepreneurship and human design because I'm the only one that has that exact little intersection of knowledge. So of
Mm-hmm.
course I have to share it. Like that just feels like the natural next step. And so I build a business that allows me to do that. And I think that clarity of mission, and I said this earlier, but I am on a mission to redirect the flow of capital from those who do harm with it to those who heal with it. Some days that means I'm on a podcast. Other days that means I'm starting a clinical business, which I have a clinical startup going right now that I'm not a practitioner in, but I'm building. All of these things still serve the mission. And that mission is because of that first line. It's because I'm so clear on this is what I need to learn how to do.
Yeah. I love that. When you started Rev and was it started with human design in mind or is that something you weaved in later?
Yes. So Rev started because I was still running at that point a fairly large business, and all these people were coming to me asking for support. I was like, oh my gosh, I do not have time because I'm running this big business, right? And then I started doing things like, okay, yes, I'll do it in trade because I don't want to make money off of this right now, but you have a cool career. And so I started doing that. And there was some human design in that and lots of other things. And then it was actually really interesting. I'm a projector, so my strategy is to be invited. And I was at a kind of looking at an office space for a project. And I'm standing there and I'm actually with one of my employees. And someone comes up and says, "What do you guys do?" And I'm first talking him up because he's awesome. And like, I'm not in the service world. And for some reason, when she said, "Well, what do you do? So you own this business?" And I said, "Yeah." And then I said, "And I also help business owners and with human design." And that person locked onto me and was like, "I have been looking for you."
Hmm.
And literally was like, "I'll hire you right now." And I was like, "I don't have any offers for this." So I went home and I slept on it. And this often happens to me. At some point during the night, splenic authority, the spleen hit. And I had the suite of offers that you can currently see on my Rev website, because as far as working with me, because it never changed. It
Mm-hmm.
just hit me like a lightning bolt. And I had no infrastructure for it. This is so third line. And I went to my senior program coordinator at the existing business and I said, "So really sorry, but sold something that we have no systems for." And I already sold it. So I'm going to need like the whole contracting flow. I need everything as soon as you can build it because I already sold one. And she thankfully was very used to me having these splenic hits and was like, "Okay, tell me what you sold." And that's how Rev started. And then I realized that everybody that was inviting me to do this work also needed support with HR, also needed adrenal health support, or also had trauma. And so that's when I started to think, oh, this is bigger than just me.
Yeah.
I want to bring together, for lack of a better term, an army of people who have amazing, most of these people have worked in like the worst of the worst, like, oil and gas or something like that, and are now taking that information and repurposing it for someone who is trying to do good in the world. So we've got an army of experts.
Mm. I love that. It like makes me so excited that you've combined like all these things into this beautiful, beautiful thing to like help people, combine, human design and business. And so with your so for me, like splenic authority, for some reason, so I have a defined spleen, sacral, and solar plexus. And so
Cool.
I've always like, as I've just been studying and talking to people and holding sessions and things like that, for some reason, splenic authority is always the one that just feels like out of grasp for like my mental knowledge, because it's just like that like one hit thing, and you
Because there's
described it
no
as
mental peace about it.
there really isn't. Well, and I think like obviously, with human design, a lot of it is getting out of the mind and into the body. And even with emotional authority, we can make it such a mental trip of like, oh my God, this, and I felt this way yesterday, and this way. And then attack. And I think that's the struggle with emotional authorities, because it can take a long time that narrative starts to play up, right? And we're having to find a way to come back to just like to the quiet of just knowing, that inner knowing. But like with splenic authority for you, so it just hits you. Like, how did you, have you always trusted that, or was that like a learned deconditioned process?
Oh, you asked a couple really good questions within that. Okay, so first of all, splenic authority, for those who don't know what it is the most primal, kind of the oldest authority, a very survival based. You are an emotional authority, and I love that on a body graph chart, which if you don't know what a body graph chart is, go on the Rev website, you get one for free. They're symmetrical, right? So if the emotional authority is on the right and the splenic authority is on the left, I always love that image of the mirror, because the way that I grasp your experience, which is very foreign to me, but what I find happens is we are almost the perfect reverse of each other's authority. So what happens for me is I don't know the answer unless I know the answer.
Mm-hmm.
And when I know the answer, it is very clear. I don't get to stay in that moment of clarity for very long unless I engage it, like unless I'm practiced at hearing it, which at this point I feel very confident. You asked a question of, was I always confident? I do think I always had a very strong sense of that survival intuitive voice. I also think sometimes I was frustrated with it because it felt almost bossy or like too much knowledge, because there's no narrative attached to the knowing. So when you're just walking through life getting these hits without understanding them, to me, when I was younger, before I had human design, like I'm talking like 18, 19, I remember very clearly feeling really resentful of whatever was happening inside of me, and almost like not wanting to listen because it was so big and so powerful. Fast forward, I love having the language for it, but I do think that as an adult, I slowly was engaging more and more with it, and it's very, very strong and powerful within me. But when I think about how it mirrors an emotional authority, so that you can maybe like picture what it would be like, because I actually have a lot of emotional authority clients, but I find that the splenic authority clients that I work with have a very hard time working with other people
Mm,
that aren't splenic, because they're like, this is so foreign, exactly what
yeah.
you said. So you process up front, and then eventually and probably you have some sort of physical, a lot of emotional authorities describe it as like a lightness or a softness, or there's
Mm,
just a grounded knowing. The visual I have is like you're riding a wave and then you land the plane, and it's kind of a
mm-hmm.
mixed metaphor, but that's what I see when I watch emotional authorities. Reverse that, and it's splenic authority. So land the plane. You don't know why the hell you landed the plane right there. You know that you have to get the plane on the ground. You know that, but you don't get to know why until sometimes years later, in my experience. And I'm sure everybody has a different relationship with this, but in my experience, I do things and act on things and then have to learn why Sometimes it's a week, sometimes it's 6 months, sometimes it's years. And I actually, one of my companies, I have two people very, very close to me in leadership that are both emotional authorities, and they have to suspend a lot of distress because I'll make a decision and they know we've worked together long enough that they know that they will probably get to the same decision, but they will have no idea what the hell I'm doing and be like, whoa, why would you do that? And then what I find really interesting is time goes by, sometimes like 10 months, like them just trusting me and being uncomfortable, which I am so grateful for their trust. And then usually they hit the same place because we're very values aligned. So we have a lot of trust. We will end up in the same place. And then almost it's like they leapfrog me because
Mhm.
they had all that time to process before they understood the decision and made the decision and made the like true commitment. So when I think of it, I think of it as like reflecting, the splenic authority might know first, but probably by the time the emotional authority knows, that's why in the human design concept, emotional authority is like where everybody's going. It's like
Mm.
the in the future. I think that the landing of the plane in an emotional authority is so powerful. It's just our world isn't really meant for either of us yet because
Yeah.
the splenic authority is very old. Like right now, it's just, I mean, people just think I'm impulsive because I would do great if I was like, you know, lost at sea, right? And it was just
Yeah.
crisis all the time.
Survival.
Yeah, that's what that
Mhm.
authority is. And then emotional authority is like we were talking about earlier, you maybe feel pressured to go with your gut and move fast and, take no prisoners when really you need that space to then jump ahead of everybody else. So it's
Mhm.
like we're in this in between time where
Mhm.
neither really feels good. But I do think we're heading towards the emotional authority. But you just have to think of it as the reverse. Whatever it
Yeah,
feels like at the end of your process
is
is
what
what
you
it
feel
feels to me at the
initially.
beginning with a lot of energy attached
Mm.
and zero understanding, which is a really weird place to
Yeah.
be.
That's
Yeah.
literally the best explanation. And I completely understand it. And it's interesting because you describe them as like mirrors. And Ra, if, for anyone listening who doesn't know, the man who downloaded the whole system, he says that, once we went from this seven centered being to a nine, that was the spleen and the solar plexus were split from one. Right. So it
Yes,
almost
exactly.
makes sense that they're two sides of the same coin, just in opposite
Hmm.
energies.
hmm
So
I
I,
think that's why I attract a lot of employees that are emotional authorities because that feels like we see each other. But I also think there's a reason that I'm not partnered with an emotional authority. I think I would drive them nuts because I'm just out here. My partner is sacral authority, so
yeah,
he's kind of also the go with the gut and has a very defined spleen. So
yeah.
it's very different, but it's still like um, the seemingly impulsiveness is not troubling. Whereas I,
Mm,
I would imagine I give a lot of credit when I hear that a splenic authority and emotional authority are living together. I'm like,
yeah.
wow, you guys have so much grace for each other. That's like such beautiful love.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, like for being emotional and then with a reflector, like and it's interesting because he's so attuned to like every nuance of like my energy. Like today we were on the phone and I wasn't as like energetic as I usually am. He's like, what's wrong? I'm literally fine. He's like, no, there's something wrong.
He's
Like,
like,
I'm
you
just,
don't know it yet. Let me know when you
yeah.
figure it out.
But it does like drive him crazy because I do go through these waves, right? Like one day I'm fine, one day I'm not, or I'll say something and then next minute I'm like, he'll like bring it up. I'm like, nah, it's over with. I'm done. Right. So it is that constant, like, obviously, and I'm seeing myself being reflected in it. So
I mean,
it's
that's a lot to navigate. And as someone with an undefined solar plexus, like that's the place where I find a lot of conditioning occurs for
mm,
me, just because it is such a big wave that you're riding. And then
mm,
because if you're undefined in that area, then you just amplify it. And then all of a sudden you're like, is this mine or not? And I know for those of you who are out there with an undefined solar plexus, it's definitely a skill to learn to be like, that's not mine.
yeah.
And for a reflector, that's like times 1 million. And I will say that reflectors tend to have better tolerance, at least what I've seen, for feeling other people's emotional waves than actually projectors with
Mm,
undefined solar plexus. And I think it's just because reflectors that they've had to create some sort of protection around them because
mm-hmm,
they're completely undefined. And so there's a lot more skill. Whereas projectors, we're often really almost encouraged to amplify other people's stuff, whether it's emotional or like sacral energy or whatever, that we get a lot of positive feedback, even when it's very destructive.
mm. Well, that makes sense too, because projectors are really learning other people, right? In order to like guide and lead and things like that. And I will say, like with the reflector, like I like even though he's attuned to my emotions, he never like gets sucked into it.
Yes.
Like he's sort of
Yes.
like, okay, I see what you're going through, like it's valid, but you know, like how can we
Mhm.
work through it or like whatever. So it is really
Yeah.
interesting because I think like on paper we, when we're learning human design, like reflectors have this certain I guess just from our limited understanding in the process of
Hmm.
learning. And he's completely different than what I on paper, right? Like learned about
Mm.
reflectors. Like there are things that
Interesting.
ring true, but overall, like the excitement of a reflector, like I just the energy, like I
Yeah.
wasn't expecting those things. But there are times where he gets home from work and I don't hear from him like all night. And I'm like, what happens? Like I just passed out. Like
Yeah,
from
totally.
being like on all day.
I
Um
have found in supporting people, because I have a longer container that people sometimes work with me that's like 3 months. And I've found that though in that 3 months, so reflectors, we're planting a seed and then we have to wait, right? It's a very different cadence than working with projectors. And I don't have a huge pool of reflectors to pull from because there just aren't a huge pool
mhm,
of
mhm.
so, but I will say, I always say there hell hath no fury like a bitter projector. Projectors will hold on
Yeah.
to a lot of the conditioning with a lot more almost like desperation. And I think it's because in the whole prophecy of human design, maybe it's because we're the newest, and
Mm,
maybe it's because like we're just like the baby design and we don't actually know how to do any of this. But I do find that reflectors kind of can take that guidance a little more
mhm.
easily, whereas projectors require, a lot more intensity, which I think is just why we all have to find support in the way that works for us and not equate it with like, oh, well, you're totally undefined, so you must be overwhelmed all the time, which might be true, or it might be that I just can give you a few somatic exercises that allow you to cleanse and let things flow through you. And then you're actually really equipped. Whereas a projector maybe doesn't have as many undefined centers, but is so conditioned because they have never had any protection
Mm.
around their aura that they have a lot harder time learning those same skills. And
Yeah.
not better or worse, it just is.
Yeah. And I'd also think like just like how you're raised in childhood would come into play with the conditioning you experience. And it's almost would be interesting because I haven't met his family yet, but I'm very curious to meet them to
Oh,
see like how
interesting.
he mirrors them. And it's like if you don't know any differently, are you just mirroring what you've grown up in?
Do we know if
Right?
he's the only
Like
reflector?
do what?
Do we know if he's the only reflector?
No, that's what I'm saying. I haven't even
You don't know
asked
their
like
designs? Oh, I'm
nope.
so
I
curious.
know. I
Yeah.
am like very curious. Like I
Hmm.
it's always on my mind to be like, can you find out your family's birth
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
information? Like obviously he knows their birth dates, but he
What
doesn't know the
anniversary
time.
is that?
Yeah.
I'm going to need all of the personal details of your
Yeah.
entire
I
family.
know,
Thank
right?
you.
We're far enough in
Let's
this
do
now.
this.
It won't be weird.
Yeah, trust me, not
So
weird. I
he already
don't,
knows
the
I'm
only
weird.
thing I don't need is their social security number. Who
Right?
cares?
Exactly. I know I went on a date with somebody once a while ago and I was asking them their birth information. And he's like, do you need my driver's license? I'm like, no. He's like, social security. I'm like, no, it's like not that serious. Just your birth.
Ah! You're like, I'm just one of those girls.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, and also this helped me build seven-figure businesses. So yeah, I'm
Right.
one of those girls.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of my questions too was like, so within the like infrastructure of Rev, like everybody that works, with you, it's built on this premise of like human design. So like you're all aware of each other's designs and like how you
Yes.
operate and things like that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say, to be fair, generators in particular, manifesting generators to some extent, don't always need to engage with their design as much as, say, a projector. Not because it's not important, but because there's a lot of completion in taking in information. So if I give you information, you can probably integrate it. And so some people on the team find it just like endlessly fascinating and study, 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 study.
Mm-hmm.
And some people just come with a specific ask and know that, hey, if that's something that's going on in the business, and this, I've done this with more than one business, they can come forward and they can understand where I think it's really interesting. And Rev is a very horizontal hierarchy in that, I mean, obviously I own it, but other than that, there's not a lot of hierarchy involved in that company. But I have had companies where there's supervisors and employees and sort of like an org chart, so to speak. And I find it really helpful if a generator is in some sort of supervisory position and
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to manage a projector. I find it really helpful to get back to the basics of why we act the way we act, because otherwise, to be honest, we're like different species,
Mm-hmm.
especially between sacral beings and non-sacral beings. And so within that company dynamic, being like, hey, you actually can't approach that person that way. They need this versus that person you can supervise this way and they'll feel really great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how does that look like within your company, like sacral versus unsacral, like that dynamic?
Well, because there's not so much of a hierarchy at Rev,
Mm.
it's not as great an example. But I would say the previous company that I just exited is a great example because we had departments and supervisors and all of that. And I find projectors really need one to be seen, and two, if a projector is still deeply conditioned, um, bitterness is very accessible and not necessarily highly directed at the right things. It's just there. Whereas generators, for instance, might really, really, really just run themselves into a wall without clear, measurable understanding of when enough is enough. I actually, one of my right hands is a quad left generator. And for those who don't know human design, the quad left part just means lots and lots of energy and go, go, go. Everything is action. And, we joke that it's like she needs and appreciates the like leash. Like, tell me when to stop, help me block schedule, and be very direct with me when my energy is going in the wrong direction because she doesn't have the vision or the seeing herself the way that a projector can see her. So she really, really loves when she's a kind of leadership. So she's someone that I supervise. She would love me saying, like, stop doing that. Do not put any more energy towards that. Put energy towards this. Me speaking to a projector like that would not work
Mm-hmm.
at all. Hell hath no fury if I spoke to a projector like that. However, what a projector might need is support in understanding how to rest because projectors tend to overfunction, overwork, and then feel very, very bitter and burnt out that they're being underappreciated. And that loving guidance that, like, hey, you've actually done enough. And the reason you're tired is because you're not self-policing. So if we look at it, it's actually not that different of a problem. It's about managing energy,
Mm-hmm.
but we have to approach it very differently because usually the projector, there has to be an invitation. So if they haven't come to me and said, like, hey, can I have help with this? You are a projector and seem to really get this. Can you please give me feedback on this? Managing a projector just by like unsolicited advice is just not going to land because I'm a projector. If I
Mm-hmm.
have a generator working for me and they have given me like a blanket invite for feedback, I can almost say anything, and it doesn't have the emotional weight that it would have if it felt uninvited.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I think if more people integrated this system, like human design and just like understanding each other, it would change so many relationships. I
Hmm.
mean, in business or
Yeah.
otherwise. Did
Well,
you
we
find
all, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
It's just really interesting because we all think that what we need, everybody else needs.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes what we don't need, but we're really good at giving is what the other person needs to receive. And what they're really good at giving is what we need to receive. And I think that's a really difficult, especially you asked about sacral and non-sacral. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
using projector and generators like an easy mirror. But if we say projectors are really good at seeing and generators are often really good at doing, and projectors often need a lot of rest. So when you think about like acts of service and acts of love, when a generator or manifesting generator is supporting someone without a defined sacral center by doing, that's so beautiful because the projector can rest. But a generator, a sacral being, maybe doesn't need help doing because they have plenty of energy. What they need is to feel seen.
Mm.
And that is something the projector has endless amounts of ability to do. And so it's just about recognizing that just because I need something doesn't mean they need something. And I shouldn't be upset that what that person has to offer isn't what I have to offer, because that's actually the beauty of this whole thing. That's actually the good part about this whole dynamic.
Yeah, yeah, and that's so beautiful. I mean, in any relationship dynamic, right? Is being able to
Mhm.
understand that.
Yeah.
Did you find any resistance like within yourself or others going from this, like clinical psychology sort of like left-brained like system
Mm.
to weaving in, human design based
Mm.
business?
A two-part answer. I mean, the first part I think is when I was in animal behavior, and actually when I was in human behavior, like in a treatment center, I was always doing that nonverbal work that is very energetic. And so I was already thinking, if you had asked my friends from the time when I was a horse trainer, they would have totally been like, oh, Alex is totally a witch. But like the girl selling training horses in Montana isn't going to like lead with that.
Mm,
That's not where the marketing went. So I definitely had, I think that's the Splenic authority. I think I
mm,
definitely had a very close relationship with my intuition. I knew that there was something happening inside of me and inside of people and inside of horses that wasn't accounted for through what I had available in language. So I think I was like primed for that. I was also deeply, deeply hurt by the Western medical system. So when I mentioned earlier that I was having these neurological episodes, they did a bunch of experimentation on me over 3 years, made me very, very ill. Took almost 10 years, well, would have been longer than that, but many, many years. And I had an advanced stage endometriosis diagnosis, to which I had horrible care for a long time, once I even got the diagnosis, and really ravaged my system. So already I was predisposed to sort of like hate that system because of what it had done to me. The people who took me seriously tended to be acupuncturists and, things like that. And so all of this to say, I was still doubtful when someone introduced it to me. And it's a funny story because someone asked, have you heard of human design? And I said, no. And they said, I think you'd be really into it. And I was like, okay, like Googled whatever chart generator came up first, typed it in, spat something out that did not resonate. And I was like, oh, confirmation bias, but like, duh. And then I was like, did I change AM to PM on my birthday?
mm,
And I realized that I hadn't. And I thought, well, it's the same day. It's going to be the same thing. But I'll just plug it in one more time. Plugged it in one more time. Totally different. Went from generator to projector. Everything changed. So immediately I knew that this wasn't confirmation bias, because the first one I had totally rejected. The second one I was like, oh gosh. And then probably 6, 8 months later, at that point, I was pretty bought in, and I had hired a mentor to teach me human design specifically. And we discovered that we were off by an hour. I pulled out my birth certificate for something, and I hadn't accounted for the fact that Arizona doesn't change time zones, and I was born in Arizona. And so I was off by an hour. Again, was like, well, it's not going to be a big deal. It's an hour. I went from having a defined route to having an undefined route. And that was the only thing that changed. And she reflected to me. She was like, that's really interesting, because if you had an undefined route, I think you'd present like this and you present the opposite. And I went, oh, but you just described my internal experience. I'm really good at presenting with that like defined pulse route measured, but inside I feel that urgency and scarcity that doesn't shut off. And I was like, that speaks to me so much more than anything else. And so it was like I had two layers of confirmation that
mm,
this system was for me in a way that only a third line would have. Like I couldn't have, it couldn't have been better for me to be introduced to it. And then I was already sold. But by that time, the second round of confirmation came in, I was like, yeah, this is for me.
mm. It's so interesting when people do pull up an incorrect chart. I like, and then when they pull up the correct one, it's like, and I
Hmm.
think like we intuitively know, like if it doesn't like
Hmm.
sit with us, right? And that's why
Yeah.
whenever I have conversation about human design, I'm like, you know yourself best. So like what I say,
Hmm.
if you know something different, but for me, my birth time was off for an hour, and it didn't change much, but it
Mm.
changed my cognition, which makes sense because I always felt
Yeah.
really resonant with undefined solar plexus. I was like, I
Mm.
feel like the people pleaser. I feel like I'm so absorbed in people's
Mm.
emotions. Like I don't understand. Like I felt defined, but I also could
Mhm.
really, really resonate with the undefined. Like I thought for sure I
Interesting.
was gonna be undefined.
Yeah.
And I went from like or outer vision to feeling cognition. And I was like, that in
Wow.
itself, like
Yep.
when I learned what that was, I was like, that's what that feeling
That's
is.
the
That's why I'm
change.
so tapped into like when people walk into a room, I can feel it, you know? So it's like
Yep.
really interesting
I
that.
also had because of the intersection with my clinical work, I've had so many experiences, and I hate to use this word because it's a little like weighted, but diagnostically, getting further with people so much faster with human design.
Mm,
I mean, recently, 30 minutes into, I have like a 3 day experience that business owners do called Manifest. And 30 minutes in, I had I had exposed some child trauma that was very specific, and I understood exactly what it was that was completely repressed. She knew her sister had experienced it. She did not know she had experienced it. And once she went to her family, all sorts of information came out that confirmed that, in fact, she had blocked a lot of this out. And without going into details, I was able to refer her to someone on my team that does specific trauma work. And that clinician said to me, Alex, this would have taken me, if I had ever gotten there, years. And this person had had lots of therapy. So she was not
mm,
someone who hadn't been working to figure out what the distress was. But I was able to literally find through reading her chart and asking her questions and seeing how, in particular, she was conditioned or deconditioned in certain areas and how that was manifesting in her body and in her patterns. Of course, some of that is my clinical training, being able to do that. I'm not saying this is just like this magic chart that just
mm,
says that to everyone. But by using that, I was able to get her probably a year or two further in clinical work so that I could pair her with someone who knew how to do that dissociative clinical work, get started immediately. They knew exactly where to work and change her life so much faster. And I've had so many experiences like that that are like, well, if I can do it in 30 minutes, why would I take a year of clinical work to do it? It's not that the clinical work isn't helpful. Now she knows she has this dissociative trauma. Of course, you
mm.
have to do good work around that. But if I can find it in 30 minutes, why wouldn't I? And I've had
Yeah.
diagnostics like that. I've found more physical ailments. All sorts of things have happened. And it just feels like a cheat to the point where it would almost be irresponsible as a provider now that I know how to use it like this to not. And that woman came to me for business support, but really what was blocking her business, which is beautiful, was this dissociation, not anything structurally or competency around her business. So
Mhm.
why don't it's like we look directly at the light, right? Like you could
Yeah.
spend years looking at her spreadsheets, but really it was a childhood trauma that was blocking this next layer of being an amazing CEO.
Hmm. I love that. Yeah, I love to hear more people with, counseling backgrounds, psychology backgrounds, things like that, fusing these two together because I think it is
Mm-hmm.
so powerful. And I think, it just in my usage and like history with human
Mm-hmm.
design, that's where I've felt a little bit of imposter syndrome creeping because I don't ever want to like provide someone with something I can't like fully support, I guess, in a way, like in the psychological aspect. And, I don't have the skills to ask the questions that to
Mm-hmm.
ask, so it is a little bit different, but I've always felt like a responsibility with this information where it's not even, astrology. I feel a little
Mm-hmm.
bit more lately it's been more intuitive and more like leaning towards astrology from
Mm-hmm.
like a psychological perspective, obviously not trained, but
Mm-hmm.
just the lens that I view it from. um but there are some things that people even just like mentioning, I don't know, just like going over aspects, right? And people
Mm-hmm.
will be like, oh my gosh, like I don't know why I never, and then it's like, yeah, I don't know where I was going with that. Just that I feel
I
like there's a
I
responsibility to
I want to
hold it.
encourage you that if someone requests a human design reading and you get them towards something that they haven't experienced before, there's no reason you can't refer out.
Yeah.
And this blocks a
Mm,
lot of people that I work with because they're like, well, what if I find this? Or what if this happens? And not just specific to human design, but just this is like if you're a specialist in one thing and you uncover something, then you just have to have a beautiful network. Because
mm,
though I am actually trained as a trauma therapist, it's not what I'm doing right now. It's not the conditions of my life are not set up to be doing heavy lifting trauma work. I did that for the better part of a decade, and you need to have certain conditions put in place to do that responsibly. So it's not wrong that I found it. In fact, it's amazing that I found it. The responsible thing in that moment was to stop, identify what had happened and say, look, this is not the container for this, but it's very clear that this is true. And so I'm going to make a recommendation as to who you should go to and exactly what you should work on. And you
Mm-hmm.
can do that. What I mean, yes, that's a very extreme version, but like it could be the same as like you're working with someone in their business and they have an HR issue. I'm not an HR professional. I
Yeah.
need to refer that out, or I'm going to give them legal advice that I have no business giving them. So I think it's about the maturity of the professional to know what their lane is, and then us all to really embrace our lanes
Mm-hmm.
because you have a lane, you have this, emotional language and this understanding of your interpretation of human design and astrology. So you should be out there doing it. And if someone asks you a question or you find something that's out of your scope, it's it's no problem. We
Mm-hmm.
should be working together. But I think we get conditioned to think that if we to be a professional, we have to be like all knowing. And I think that's
Yeah.
really capitalist and really like keeps us from collective work, which
Mm-hmm.
capitalism wants. Like it's like, oh yeah, feel that way because then you'll work for someone else and then you'll never step forward because you'll always have imposter syndrome. And I'm like, no, no, name what your mission is and what you're good at and know your skill set and be confident enough to know when you have surpassed that and make sure that your network is robust enough that now you know who to refer to in that moment. So if you stumble upon something, you're going to be able to call me because we've met now and say, hey, who's that trauma person that's human design informed that I can refer to? And I'm going to be like, cool, her name's Bree. Here's her number. Get that person to her right away.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And I think that kind of, my thoughts were kind of going back to the beginning, right? Of like whether like following that entrepreneur drive and desire and like you said, we're often, I guess, like that imposter syndrome comes in due to outside conditioning, like, oh, well, you can't do that, you can't do this. And even just, me being like, well, I'm not a psychologist, like I can't hold the space, right? And I think that you're right. You're like, we are taught these things from external sources that really kind of keep us down in this like one path that like doesn't serve the whole. And I love that you talk about like this mission to like share it, because when I
Yeah.
first learned human design, like that is sort of, but always been my thing. It's like human design literally changed my life in so many different ways. And it's like, why wouldn't I share that with other people, even if it's just helping people understand how to read a chart so that they can then use it in their practice or whatever they're doing. And so I think that's really just, I don't know. It's just, you have a beautiful
Why
mission,
wouldn't we?
and
Why wouldn't
yeah.
we? And I did a reading for actually a very accomplished therapist who has a big multiple hundreds of therapists that work under her. And I don't know anything about her, but I did kind of like an intro reading just because we met and it was nice. And she was like, uh, why aren't we doing this for all of our clients? Because I didn't give you any content and you know the core of me. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
right, that's what it's all about. And it's not that all the content doesn't matter, but we get to really see each other. And I think it's so useful. And I think it's where I think more and more people are getting comfortable with it. Because even a couple years ago, very few people that I met knew what human design was in America. I would say more people, if I engaged internationally, did. And
Mm-hmm.
now it's rare that I meet someone who doesn't at least know, like, oh, yeah, I've heard of that. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, I'm in a certain circle of, a certain type of person. But at the same time, it's not that narrow of a circle. I'm finding like, oh, this accountant has heard of it, right? And I just think that that's how fast it's changing. And I
Yeah.
think that's what we're prepping for that 2027 date, which is big in human design. And you
Yeah.
can feel it ramping up.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So with Rev, do you have, is it just solely entrepreneurs or it's anyone
Mm-mm.
within any sort of business that comes to you? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so most of the people who engage with me personally on the team are either aspiring entrepreneurs or trying to make some big change just because the work that I do is incredibly close touch. And so you have to really be in the midst of some big change to want that level of mentorship. And a lot of people, sometimes people will come and even do a few days with me in the smaller intensive, and I'll refer because we'll discover like, oh, actually, your adrenals are completely rocked. And so we need to take you to Carla, who's going to really work on your burnout because sure, they may even identify as wanting to start a business, but and Carla says this beautifully. She's like, whatever you build on top of is what will be. And so even if someone does come and say, Alex, I want to hire you, and this is the business, if we do spend some time together and the foundation would not hold a safe business, we're going to have you work with other people on the team until you're ready to do that. Some people come that don't have any interest in entrepreneurship, but are looking for very thoughtful, integrative services. So everybody on the team is highly specialized, many master's degrees, all of that, and they're influenced by biohacking and human design and all of these things that often you don't find in such a professional package. So it's a pretty wide variety. But I would say the common thread is very high functioning and almost too badass for their own good.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we need to like do a part two of this because I would love
I
to get
know.
into
I think
like
we're
trauma
friends
work and
now.
everything. I know. I know. And my daughter has a therapy appointment at 6. So I'm like, oh my gosh.
Awesome.
But
Good for
yeah,
her though.
this has been so fascinating. And I just think like I said, I'd love to see human design being, combined and woven into something so powerful like this because there is, I mean, whether you're an entrepreneur or just working a 9 to 5 or anything, like part of my mission and my goal is just helping us remember who we are because we're so
Yes.
disconnected from our body, from we just believe the narrative of our mind and we're in this like hamster wheel that just never
Mhm.
stops and we're miserable and like all these things. And so I just think that, whether it's somatic work, whether it's, like
Mhm.
the adrenals or trauma work, like it's so important to be doing.
Mhm.
So I honor what you're doing. And I think it's
Oh,
just incredible
I'm
to,
so glad we
yeah,
met. I'm
I
like,
know.
okay, cool. This is great. You're one of my people. And no, I agree. I think we're in a moment of transition and I think of it as like freeing people. And I think our culture has gotten so removed from the body. And so without human design allows a language and allows an approach that doesn't involve appropriating all sorts of different cultures in order to grasp at straws to find a way to connect with our bodies again. Because the bottom line is, I'm many generations away from any sort of human that had connection to their body in the way that passenger consciousness can allow. And so, I can look around and I can try to take from other cultures, but the end of the day it's pretty dangerous. You
Mm.
start appropriating things that are not meant for you. Human design is new enough and I feel very confident it is meant for me and people who feel as detached from their history so that we can start making a new history so that the people that come after us don't feel so detached and like you just described in their head and not able to drop into who we're supposed to be. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I mean, if you want to let everyone know where they can find you, how they can work with you, of
Sure.
course, I'll have everything in the show notes as well.
Awesome. Yeah. You can Google Rev Human Design. It's REV because we're here for the revolution.
Mhm.
My Instagram is just alex.mufson. So hopefully that'll be in the show notes. I would say if you have no idea what we're talking about, please download. It's really important to me that we're not gatekeeping this information, that the only way to get to it is not paid. So you can get a free chart on our website. And it does have some like very basic descriptions so that you can get started. So make sure to get that on the Rev site.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.